Okay, so back to criticizing Bret Weinstein based on the exchange that he had with Douglas Murray. This is a similar complaint that I keep on raising about Bret Weinstein. And, he freely admits it himself that, sort of this is an argument that is in the valence of what has been, sort of stereotyped as the bleeding heart liberal. And here's why it's not, like that's the kind of workaround that he kind of has. But, and he is aware in some regard of the type of uh, decadence that his kind of rational compassion, the idea is that, well, you never want homeless people, not because there aren't people who don't deserve to be homeless because they have literally made all the bad decisions and that they, in some sense, really can't be helped because they're not helping themselves and they don't wish to help themselves, but that it's better for everyone else for there to be no homeless people, so we should still prevent there being homeless people. The problem with that kind of uh, logic is actually, I'm going to look. I understand that this is going to be perhaps what I'm about to say is going to be labeled as sophistry, but essentially because it lacks a certain level of engaged compassion or enlightened compassion with such individuals that actually are crying out in some sense for judgment against their um, unexercised agency. You know, and I'm going to make a kind of a tragic argument here, which is around the necessity of having a vital or robust or, let's say, non-pathological and healthy culture. We actually need to have a functioning culture. We need to have a culture that isn't dysfunctional. And at some point, that means that you have to bootstrap agency into how people are regarded, into how people are thought about. Because if you just awash every issue with sympathy, that you can sympathize, well, not with the individual themselves, but for the rest of society that has to put up with having that dysfunction around them. So we need to kind of diminish it, so that we need to disguise the consequences of people's decisions from themselves. The reason why this creates a dysfunctional culture is because at some point consequences have to manifest just for there to be a kind of a cultural awareness of their existence, because otherwise you start to live in a delusional, kind of you, you live in some kind of artificial paradigm that has been crafted and engineered, and you don't even perhaps understand or have any kind of awareness about how the functioning in your society operates or is orchestrated, because it's happening on the level of social engineering. It's happening automatically or something like that. It's that these ills are removed from reality preemptively, uh, in a way in which people themselves, inhabitants of such a culture, are going to essentially be unconscious denizens of such an environment. Again, I've framed that a bit abstractly. Let me put it in more real terms. I don't think we realize the depravity that we're going to be subsidizing and encouraging in some sense by not allowing people to be confronted with more basic forms of consequences, as it were, and by essentially denigrating the very concept of personal responsibility. Um, that is that is a value that needs to be culturally enshrined, because without it, you're going to have a kind of listlessness. You're going to have a kind of pervasive indolence that is going to be perversely incentivized. And that's the kind of thing that I know that Bret Weinstein is sensitive to, because he says he actually underlines this problem, but his thinking has not incorporated this problem. And I haven't made my case properly. I'm going to have one more shot at it. That the biggest culmination of what I'm trying to say, which is something that Bret does not understand, about the necessity of bootstrapping consequences for decisions, which is essentially personal responsibility or individual agency. And this is going to sound hypocritical from from the point that I'm making, is that you cannot protect people from the consequences. You cannot design a system that is going to automatically protect people from the consequences of their bad parenting and their bad developmental upbringing. You cannot design a system that indemnifies people from their own from the consequences of the quality of their own development and parenting, because then essentially you are competing with the family. The state is therefore then competing with the family in an ideological way, which is completely unsustainable, which will cultivate a culture which is devoid of responsibility and consequences for behavior and actions and decisions. So it is a necessity to bootstrap agency within culture. It is an absolute necessity. And especially if we are moving into an age in which, the quality of one's upbringing or something like that, or the consciousness with which people are needing to uh, basically it's a generally lose scenario if you try to design a system in which it doesn't matter how good or how bad your parents were at raising you. The system is going to indemnify you from that bad luck, in inverted commas, because we're going to care about the fairness to the individual child and not to essentially caring about bootstrapping cultural agents or cultural individual responsibility. And I understand that, I seem to be making a bit of a strange argument that in order to protect individual responsibility, we actually have to essentially create the cultural message and the cultural propaganda that the system is not on the hook for the fact that your parents did a bad job. Because you see, if you don't send that message, you are creating a huge perverse incentive, let's say a lowest common denominator, which is completely unsustainable, that is literally culturally toxic and poisonous, and will generate a it will exacerbate what already exists, and it will, because at some point, I mean, the problem with okay, so like I'm sympathetic to some elements in Bret's worldview, which is that you want to be people that are in a bad situation, you want to give them a way that they could help themselves to recover from a bad situation. You want to be able to facilitate people in I can't remember the exact phrase, but sort of I can't remember what the phrase is, but sort of bettering their lot in life. That there should be a system, there should be a procedure, where you can essentially get on the path and it is somewhat structured to help people overcome situations which are bad. But like the real problem is that when people are trapped by their own bad decisions, their own poor decisions, and let's say and then they become trapped by, let's say, the consequences of their own bad decisions, then it's called a systemic problem. This is this is a semantic inception into a very toxic worldview that we have to resist. That somehow a collective absorbs the responsibility for people who have I'm trying to think of the word that means sort of criminal intent, that not to do with criminal law, but essentially that they knowingly made the bad decisions, but they allowed themselves to do so. That they did not have the resilience to not to inhibit themselves from making those poor decisions. They declined to develop and to some sense, I think that does become a cultural the prevalence of that kind of bad management, as it were. You could say, that is something that becomes commutable. It's almost like a cultural contagion that in a subculture or in a kind of you essentially, a lot of people that complain about systemic oppression, they're always harping on about and whining about the fact that certain stereotypes exist and that those stereotypes somehow imprinted onto people and forced them to make bad decisions. And essentially what I'm trying to do is create a, let's say, a moral paradigm and almost a philosophical point of view which actually solves that complaint, because that makes that complaint impossible if this becomes the new cultural standard. And that's why I think that in some sense what I'm proposing needs to be the kind of the base perspective. It needs to be the default moral structure. And and you can try to do proactive things, but again, like those proactive projects and things like that, they need to be designed intelligently, and they can't be a kind of trying to arrive at some hypothetical reset point or something like that destroys a culture of accountability and bootstrapping of individual agency. And there are and even Bret's argument about, well, the sexual politics in the black community has been distorted by the shortfall of the availability of black men relative to black women. Therefore, you can understand that there's a structural and a systemic condition which is precipitating and shifting things towards like a certain kind of pathology or something like that, as a kind of as a structural effect. Obviously, so you're talking about something that has a statistical manifestation. That has a statistical that is reflected in a statistic. Or I mean, although you're perhaps conflating things that you don't know what else you're conflating with, and I would say that this is more to do with the sickness in culture. I mean, I guess you could say that, well, it actually exacerbated the toxification of culture because all these things, the stars aligned, and then you created a kind of consciousness that best fit the structural conditions. But I mean, I must say, I'm not that sympathetic with that kind of wishy-washy, because essentially it completely undermines, again, the cultural bootstrapping that needs to happen. Um, and also, I mean, I do think it distracts from the point that culture really is a very powerful force. And, as human beings, we could be using culture, in much more sophisticated ways that help promote problem solving and things like that. And to kind of to skew the burden and the moral responsibility onto a kind of infantilist interventionist role that the state must play in sort of taking care of things. Um, I mean, to the extent that that is a failure in politics, it's first a failure in culture. And I do think that we have to fix culture before we can even get a handle on having some kind of sane and normal politics. But anyway, this is so I'm very for blaming people for falling in with toxic culture. I mean, it's perhaps this, you could call it a temperamental on my behalf. I'm being somewhat biased because I just happen to have a temperament which is more independent than others, perhaps, and other people that are more affiliative by nature can't help but via osmosis, metaphorically, absorb um, imitating and mimicking patterns of whatever, but and norms and judgments and prescriptions, and falling in with some kind of lowest common denominator. But again, I think that that is generally because um, we have diminished the role of the meaningfulness of individual actions, and their natural consequences, as it were. We've divorced the idea that decisions and behavior have natural consequences, and by mislabeling those consequences as systemically created. And in some sense, both can be true, but I still think that systemically created consequences then are a is a strange description of something that could be avoided and that should be avoided by more responsible individuals. Um, yeah, and the culture that doesn't bootstrap that is going to just create more mediocre or mediocrity and sort of dependencies of some kind or another, but also that you're going to have dysfunctional manifestation. There's always going to be an outlet. There's always going to be, I think to some degree, the extent to which that culture creates a blind spot on individual accountability by attaching to it, this kind of intellectual mumbo jumbo of systemic explanations for it. That is, in some sense, I think, what precipitates the dysfunction. And I see Bret Weinstein doing this in real time, and he can't help himself because he doesn't see the necessity and the greater need for having a culture that is essentially non-pathological. And there's no way of getting around this, especially when you center it around the family. When you center it in terms of the family, the only way that you're actually going to get functional families is if you say, and you have it be a cultural truism, that your fate is going to be largely dictated, or your opportunity in life is going to be very much shaped by the health of your family structure, or the togetherness of your family structure, or the concerted application of responsibility by your parents, or supporting family structure. And that sadly, like, that is something that is slightly tragic. I mean, I'm not going to agree with, I'm not going to disagree that, like, that isn't unjust to the individual child. Yes, it is going to be unfair to the individual child, but you cannot maximize fairness. You cannot achieve perfect fairness unless you make the family unit completely insignificant and obsolete. And in, essentially, if you're going to have the state compete for the family unit, that's the only way that you're going to ever be able to solve systemic problems, is if you essentially believe, almost, if you have the same relationship to the state as the fascists have relationships to their state, that it should be a kind of a family belonging and membership to a society in which your fate is underwritten. And so, I mean, I should have taken more notes while I was listening to Bret Weinstein say the things that he did, because he did actually encapsulate the crux of the thing that I always complain about him for doing. And because it goes deeper than this, there are problems, there are technical problems with the things that he says, because he's talking about things that are fundamentally nebulous when he says that people need to be protected from bad luck. So, like, bad luck already means essentially consequences of something. And so let's not, distinguish between, because I do think that, I mean, bad luck is already going to be a fudged entity. It's not going to be, it's not, it doesn't have a stable definition. And there are technical problems with what he is setting up, because it ends up being a kind of a generalization upon a generalization upon a generalization. And the whole thing is actually unworkable. I believe it is unworkable. In terms of his general vision of how society should have certain protections, I mean, it is true that when you are investing into raw development of some kind of knowledge or science or something like that, I mean, it is true that I think that can't be done very well in the private sector. You can't do, like, long-term, purely explorative research unless you have, like, a monopoly in something like that. Probably, unless you have some monopoly on some industry, it's going to be very hard to just do, like, raw general research. And also the horrible perverse incentives, because, if you actually find something that makes your own product obsolete, there's nothing stopping you from just bearing that. So I do think that research is probably something that requires publicly funded, structures, probably. But there are, let's say, market failures and things like that, or, I mean, there are perhaps ways around that. It does require some kind of concerted effort from good meaning people that actually come up with something, because, there's nothing stopping crowdsourcing pure research. It would just require some kind of better journalism, perhaps, to vet prospective, models of research teams, and work out, which credentials of certain people, and who are actually the luminary stars and fields that are worth, I mean, I guess it's going to have a problem in terms of its marketing. How are you going to judge who the charlatans are, or who the people that should really be backed in terms of research? But I mean, essentially, there could be things like crowdfunding. Um, I mean, in some sense, that is the best way. In some sense, the only way to get something that's clean and independent is if it's paid for by people and they get what they pay for, and people are actually willing to pay for it. When you are trying to get somebody else to spend money on behalf of that kind of idea, that's when things go really bad, because then it's all backrooms and government officials, and who knows, industry speaking in the ear of who people, it's just, it loses its independence. This idea that you can just kind of create a mechanism that's going to be self cleansing or something like that. And again, this is why I think that in some sense the best way to solve something like homeless people is people that actually are interested in finding a solution. But it won't be a fix-all solution. It won't work for every homeless person. But let's just say someone actually has really a good enough, reasonable solution that they've got a formula of how they will house people and rehabilitate them and help them with certain problems. But obviously they won't be able to help everyone, because not everyone will be able to conform to that kind of rehabilitative program or something like that. And so they have to have a screening process. And so I do think that this is the thing, is that to actually help the world, it can't just be a kind of an automatic fix-all. It has to be something that has, let's say, a screening process attached to it. And the state really has huge problems trying to have screening processes attached to their programs. It's very hard for a state to be selective like that, which is generally why I think the general solution to a lot of problems would be NGOs created by other countries, or something, or funded by foreign money, that you'd have NGOs fixing problems in your country, because then you can actually be selective. NGOs can be selective about how they select their beneficiaries, essentially. I think that is generally the general formula of how you can optimize for having a society function well. Um, and you actually have real intelligent plans that are the rubber meets the road. But the idea that you're just going to sort of undermine the development of a culture that would avoid a lot of these problems, and not use culture as, let's say, one of the important and vital arms of actually making any inroads into fixing these solutions, but you're going to continue this dysfunctional culture while pretending that that you're not dealing with largely a psychological component um, of toxicity. I should try to make that point properly about the bad luck, I guess. But I have detailed this in another recording. But he did make his argument slightly more clear in this conversation with Douglas Murray. Um, but I think that is a better way of putting it, is that essentially what you're trying to say and do when you're trying to overcome systemic oppression to a large degree is you're trying to say it doesn't matter how children are developed, it doesn't matter how children are brought up, it doesn't matter the quality of parenting, should not matter to the outcome of a child. And as soon as you say that, you have just uninvented the human being. As soon as that is the general solution to how you're going to fix systemic problems in society, you have just uninvented um, individual integrity, because you want to indemnify people from their own inculcated character. And also, if people are not responsible for rearing their own children or directing and parenting the development of their own children, then you have uh, and this is the problem, I guess, as well, is that instead of saying that, like, we're dealing with very, very bad parenting here, instead you say, oh, we're dealing with systemic oppression. You know, it's a nicer way of couching it. It's a nicer way of expressing what is essentially the same substantive issue at the root of it, at the core of it. But the one has got a very sympathetic sob story attached to it. Well, it's not their fault that they're bad parents. It's not their fault that they're failing in doing what they should be doing. It's somebody else's fault. It's everyone's fault. It's us. It's us together. And this is an insoluble mess that is literally making the issue insoluble for no other reason than wanting to say that no, 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 these people should still be respected in their failing to be a decent parent. It's a weird kind of acceptance of something that is deeply denigrating on a level that you can't even respect people enough to sort of to tell them the truth, phrased in the language of their own agency and responsibility, or omitted responsibility. Because we don't want to talk about omitted responsibility, we're going to invent a language about systemic oppression, because we have to reach a reset point. Well, we're never going to reach that reset point without fixing culture. That's my basic claim. And that culture is a necessity to having a vision of even what's going on. So we can't even talk about defining the real problem in terms of, let's say, the lack of parenting and the toxicity in culture, which then is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy of dysfunction. We're going to talk about weird, strange, nebulous statistics that justify why people structure their lives in such a fundamentally pathological way. So we're not even addressing the point at which that these problems get solved, because the mystique put on the spin put on it by Bret is that these conditions are not chosen; they're statistically generated by inherited conditions, and that is also who knows if that's a false reduction. Even Bret says himself that like we can't prove it, and it's this is the problem, is that you've created a hypothetical reduction of a problem that is insoluble. Why did you even just do that then? I mean, you've just wasted everyone's time, and you've created a distraction so that you can sound more sympathetic, so that you can bake in this excuse for denigrating the people that you supposedly are offering sympathy to, so that they can have a kind of ideological form of integrity under the umbrella of the systemic oppression. I mean, this is just junk. This is a form of slave morality, and it actually gets in the way of solving the problem. So, damn, I need to go deeper into the bad luck thing. I was going to try to get to the point when I was talking about the scientists and stuff like that. Is that the reason why you can't necessarily always indemnify people against bad luck is because somehow some people have better vision than others. They have a more, it's sort of like they're not, it's not just rolling the dice. It's not just random. You see, like when you talk about that bad luck must be randomly distributed, that that's a, it's a, I mean, that's kind of as bad as identity politics, because that's like a double negative right there. So you cannot look at a distribution and say that it's not random. You cannot do that. There is no way. There is no. There is no test for randomity. I mean, like, this is like a deeply philosophical, metaphysical question. But I mean, like, describing something as random and not random is not a closed. It doesn't have a closed answer. You can't make that determination. So, I mean, you could say, well, it really is randomly distributed. And to some degree, I understand the skepticism against that kind of claim, but you can't actually refute it. So watch out, because you can't actually refute it. And that's technically true, you can't. And I understand that the sophistry and politics is identity politics is based on standing on a bank of statistical insinuations and things like that, and saying this isn't random. But I mean, it's an intellectually flawed system of interpretation. It really is. I mean, the whole thing is, it becomes a tautological narrative, and Bret is using one of these tautological narratives. It's fucking embarrassing. Okay, but yeah, to say that no, well, our society is going to be defined by the fact that bad luck is randomly distributed, and that we've reached a reset point. I mean, he's honest enough, I guess, to say is that you can't test for these things. You'll never be able to know if you've reached the reset point. So man, it's so dark. I mean, I've taken better cracks at this. I'm not remembering this arm of my argument, but it is it is actually wrong. It has so much extracting oughts from is's built into it. It has a kind of it uses the conclusions of its own argument in its premise. It begs its own question. It's circular logic. It's tautology. It's based on a kind of moral tautology. I guess all I have to say is, like, watch out, Bret. Uh, this is a vortex of. And you think you can get away with it because, as you say, it's self-consistent. That's not good enough. It really isn't. And you think that, well, it's so compelling. It's so, it's so simple. It kind of it's a good rule that we should follow. It's actually garbage, because how you if you just tried to implement this in a simple way, if you try to actually apply it, it would become a factual question that would have no soluble answer as well. It would have to be fudged. You would have to tell yourself, well, now we've done enough and now we should move on. And like, but it would have no internal regulating principle that you would know that you've actually done it to the extent needed. It has no breaks. It doesn't itself know when it's finished providing it's the process that it prescribes. It's it is intellectually embarrassing, and I wonder the extent to which that Bret has to do this in order to preserve his so-called liberal credentials. I mean, I consider myself to be a very liberal person. I just think that it has to be done upon a foundation of respecting libertarian values and principles. Because if you, to the extent to which that you undersell the individual, or that you undermine the individual ethos, you have actually built into your system a whole layer of delusion and self-deception and infantilism. And I do think that this has, I've in my last recording talking about Douglas Murray, I spoke, no, actually I don't even know if it was about Douglas Murray, but I spoke about an issue and I was thinking about something that Douglas Murray said, but I mean he said it before a few times, about that society has a God-shaped hole, that something has to be in that place. But to me, I think that the reason why atheism grew for so long, or agnosticism at least grew for so long in the West, was because of government putting in the guardrails for society, because government used law, a certain style of moral prescription, which undermined people's sense of ownership of themselves, and because they felt like that they were being tutored by the state and framed by the state, they had no individual expression to search for the answers, because the answers were provided for them, or within the lines, like within very strict, sort of parameters. And because culture essentially was not given enough leeway to govern it, to control itself. Because you see, when culture becomes, let's say, the prescriptive force in morality and not the law, when the law is not the prescriptive force over morality, but culture itself defines a prescriptive force over morality independently of the law, i.e., that it's not enforced by the law, but it's only enforced by, let's say, cultural compliance and adherence, then you've got a model of voluntarism in some sense that shows to people their own dignity, their own intrinsic integrity, and that their cultural belief system, in some sense, and their ability to convince others, perhaps, or to share the same cultural belief system, or to persuade, and actually has real efficacy in terms of prescribing moral conduct. That in some sense you actually have a anyway. It's not that people are forced to do what the group wants them to do. It's just an example of the fact that what you in fact believe has a real effect, a real global effect, or potentially has a global effect, and therefore your change of belief and your ability to persuade other people to believe different things has a real deep connection to the potential flow of history, even, that you are part of an organically developed society that can be shaped by its individuals. And when you're in that kind of structure, there's a different importance and urgency over your attention. There's a different kind of dignity and integrity to your thinking, because it's not merely there to be framed by state power. It's there to be framed by how you want to frame it and persuade other people to frame it within the independent sphere of culture itself. And that isn't the same thing as spirituality, but it's a metaphor for an individual ethics and spirituality that is empowering, um, and leads one to have a properly considered life, I think, in more of the proper sense. But I mean, okay, that's a very sophisticated, highfalutin effect of what I'm describing. But I do think that to a large extent we are losing that to these somewhat more trivial confusions of the type that I see Bret's um, committing, getting stuck in this kind of in this recursive uh, lockdown that it just keeps on referring back to its own skeptical, double negative, you know, presupposition that it wants to hold to be true, which is that, you know, we should make sure that bad luck is randomly distributed, which is like, you know, his intellectual translation of how we should think about um, dealing with systemic oppression. While that paradox itself is exactly what stops culture from being regenerated or making any kind of substantial recuperation. Man, I was making a recording. I don't know if I uploaded it or not. It was a bit embarrassing talking about feminism. And at the end, I think I got into some of these points, but I didn't continue to cover all the points that I wanted to. But right at the end, I started to make a few new points. Sorry, I just realized how tired I was. Now I don't want to continue this recording. But anyway, I think I said everything that I wanted to say. So I guess I am making in a roundabout way, I am making the argument that the cultural dependence on essentially arbitrary authority to clarify and provide essentially an external locus of control for people's moral, um, what is, in fact, you can't describe it in any other way other than a slave morality, that essentially that that people's moral well-being is guaranteed, creates a kind of a toxic, endemic sort of doom spiral that is which makes it then impossible to have a sane political democratic um, republic, you know, and that essentially you've already morally got the framework of a kind of some kind of totalitarian state. And I do think that people don't realize this, that the kind of the cultural weakness that has been bred by essentially substituting the state for a kind of religious um, uh, devotion that should be grounded and centered in uh, someone's, you know, because essentially the state, if you're going to substitute religion for the state is then thrust upon you. So it's like having your religion thrust upon you. And so you can imagine how that's basically the kind of the totalitarian recipe. It's like you have to believe in a religion that you didn't choose as an individual. So you've kind of outsourced religion into an affiliative, collective aspect of culture, which is, I mean, I've generated a good definition of fascism. I think that very clearly puts this identity politics and this kind of cultural mood. It describes it quite well as fascistic, because essentially, can I remember my own definition well enough? It's something like fascists see culture a as something to uh, they see it as a function of their politics to um, uh, regulate. They're essentially a fascistic state tasks themselves with regulating and, let's say, purifying culture, because it doesn't have an independent mode left within the citizenry to make up their own mind and their own choices and elections of freedom of conscience. Um, and in some sense, we've done that in the moral realm now. And I think Bret Weinstein still has a kind of hangover of this from his, let's say, liberal indoctrination. And essentially, you could call it, I mean, in some sense, I can even describe it with some liberal language to show the fallacy and the error in this thinking, which is that, okay, first of all, you have to regard culture as actually being an important part of society, and that tragically it requires its own sort of necessity to upkeep it and to allow it to make the requisite mistakes in order for it to self-correct and maintain its independent, sort of structure in terms of the independence of the individual. I mean, that keeps that inculcated within its structure. Um, but that essentially you could call it the right of the family. That, and this is going to sound perverse, but essentially, and I do think that on some level that this is how it should be framed in liberal politics, um, is that you have competing rights, and they have to no right is absolute, and they have to be weighed against one another. And in some sense, you actually have to give some birth to the consequences of people's actions and allow them to manifest, even as they settle on victims, that it is unfair that those victims suffer those consequences. And in some sense, they are victims, because I would say that the children of irresponsible parents are victims, and it is unfair that they go through what their parents put them through. But that is the right of a family to be dysfunctional. That families have a right to, I mean, obviously this has to be constrained. There should be some, obviously, threshold that if it's crossed, then the child is removed from the family. But I think that actually states the case much more clearly. That we actually have to tolerate families being, I mean, we don't have to be happy about it. We don't have to perhaps create awareness and try to do something that might uh, uh, facilitate upliftment and change and development, and to try to create education or do lots. I mean, there are lots of intelligent things that can be done to improve situations, but fundamentally, there is no decent place for the state, essentially, to countermand, uh, let's say, the right of the family unit. And if it does so, it's really doing something quite alien. It's doing something quite intrusive. And in the moral sense, it is crossing a line which you might as well call cultural totalitarianism at that point. Because at what point are individuals the arbiters of their cultural realm that they inhabit, and that they are co-denizens and participants in negotiating what that culture is? And at what point is their culture dictated to them by some kind of political mouthpiece, which is in a democracy is supposed to gain its uh, um, it's supposed to gain its what's the word, validity. I can't think of the right word, but it's supposed to gain its legitimacy by representing the population. Well, at some point, you have to bootstrap autonomy within a population so that there is something to be received. You can't create a kind of a reductive feedback loop that doesn't make sense. Um, and that is effectively what you try to do when you try to say, well, no, well, the government must be on the hook for making sure that bad luck is not um, unevenly distributed, or to guarantee that bad luck is evenly distributed, or something like that. I think there is actually something fundamentally pernicious about that kind of prescription. I think that it does involve the imposition of a cultural totalitarianism. And it does cross this fundamental line, which essentially invalidates the integrity of culture and its connection with individuals, and it turns them into essentially a kind of moral serf, or as Nietzsche would put it, slave morality. It makes them subject to a slave morality. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have progressive policy and a progressive state. It just means that it has to be framed slightly differently. It can't be absolute guarantees. It can be something like there are you want to make access available for people. You want to make the state should be, let's say, liable to providing access for um, let's say, making sure that you know I mean, but this is in some, in the same way that in the American political system, that the original Republican Party was very perturbed by wage slavery, by the concept of wage slavery, that there be no alternative to people having essentially monopolies over, in some sense, it was almost like naively proto-Marxist in some sense, that if there was a monopoly on the means of production, um, and there was no way that you could effectively amass capital, or gain access to um, setting anything up or something like that there was no way that you could live your life and navigate it in such a way that you could actually access opportunity, or access some instrument of facilitating the betterment of your lot in life, um, or to accept the fact that it would be an intergenerational um, escalator of bettering the lot of your children's lives because of making all the right decisions. But that, I do think that in some sense government must be on the hook for, and in some sense this, I think that this can be guaranteed by uh, not being as proactive as one might think, in terms of, in terms of I mean, I would say the best way to do this is to create programs that self-terminate, that programs that don't create dependence, that essentially that are that that literally are like a halfway house, that literally phase themselves out in the use of them by a particular beneficiary or something like that, and that there is a residual benefit after, uh, because if it doesn't sort of meet that kind of criteria, then it's probably a bad policy, because it doesn't actually transform a situation. It's just a kind of subsistence in some sense. Um, not that subsistence isn't also uh, sometimes called for, um, but that has to be regarded as almost, sort of complete abject failure, that essentially that this problem or this issue is just completely insoluble and cannot be transformed into an integrated society, that someone is, let's say, perpetually lost in some sense, um, which is means that it's kind of pure, unadulterated sort of compassion that is in some sense also alienating a member of society. Um, and I would also say that it starts to encroach on their fundamental dignity as well. That you can't actually find a place to integrate them. But anyway, there might be such cases. Obviously, sort of medical cases and such, or people that have severe and extreme states of necessity. I mean, there are other cases in which subsistence is probably called for. If there's a single mother with young children, um, and they don't have money for food, nutrition is, especially in developing children, is massively, um, you know, is kind of a higher ranking necessity, because the lack of feeding young children the right nutrition at the right stage of their life is going to um, precipitate, monstrous consequences, sort of globally, that it's not worth, in terms of the trade-off, not not going for that investment is going to, at that point, is going to create an incalculable, disproportionate downside uh, for everyone, because anyway, but I'm not going to excruciatingly go into the details of that, but essentially you're wiping out IQ points of children when you're not giving them nutrition at the right phase of development, essentially. I mean, that's another sort of general point as to the kinds of general measures and awareness, and that might be promoted just in the general population as a whole. But anyway, well, this is a bit of a tangent, but so, I mean, even wholesale, I'm not opposed to measures taken by government. I'm just, let's just say, I'm incredibly suspicious of them, and in some sense, it's better if the government is literally providing access to something, or ensuring access to something, rather than actually providing the thing itself directly. Because as soon as the government gets involved in providing the thing directly, you have just perversely incentivized people not you've deprogrammed culture not to seek that thing to some degree, because you've just made it an amenity, or you've made it an expectation, or you've made it a kind of, that the government is on the hook for ensuring that somehow this gets to the people um, that it's targeted for. And so government has to do it obtusely when people could do it directly for themselves, and they could do it in a much more intelligent fashion. They could do it in a much more empowered fashion, therefore. And so when government almost takes the least direct approach in making sure that people get the things that they have a right to get, you could say, or something like that, um, that is literally by far the most responsible way to do it, and the most sort of the long term thing that doesn't that's the kind of the long-term panacea, that, and I mean, this is how I see culture growing up and maturing. I mean, I've spoken in one of my recordings about the development of an enlightened culture. In fact, I don't know if I uploaded that one, but I don't think I did upload that one. That's because I didn't finish it. I should probably still upload it, even if, because I got the major concept out, but man, this is going off the rails. I'm quite tired. Was that all the other points that I wanted to make? But yeah, I mean, I understand that that sounds perverse, but in some sense, I think you have to almost conceptualize it as the right of the family to have at least some level of dysfunction that is allowable, that is permitted to the family. But they are not, just because, let's say, the government, I'm talking somewhat metaphorically and in a kind of in a moral public context of public policy, but essentially, if that is how it is conceived, that it is the right of the family to be dysfunctional to at least some degree, obviously, perhaps not exceeding some certain severe degree, but if it is the right of the family to be dysfunctional on some level, but the government, because essentially that right is the public declaration and concession to the individual that their decisions, their behavior, uh, has a real effect, and the public does not indemnify uh, the individual for the exercise of that right. The public sphere does not fit the bill for the you know to some degree of deprivation transpiring from you know the dysfunction within uh, the family arrangement. I mean, this is indicative of this general point that I've been trying to describe, which is that people need to feel like that culture is their own culture, to some that they joint and severably, culture belongs to them. It is owned by them in a joint and severable fashion, and they are participants in this collective medium which they individually own and that they jointly own with everyone else. And that probably, I mean, to put that in a systematic understanding, then you have to understand that the boundary of the family, um, all those issues as translated into the family unit, as being a subcomponent of culture, or at least a subcomponent of how culture reproduces itself, that there is a distance between that and the state, and the reach of the state, and the moral and the moral and the moral sentiments that the people leading the state might have, which are supposedly representatives of the people and that gain their legitimacy by people voting for them. That if that autonomy in the people and over the culture is subordinated, um, in a very denigrating way, I'll say as well, because when the state is legally delineating morality, that is like a religious function. That is like a religious um, uh, uh, anyway, so and I do think that the state has done these things. I mean, it did it within gender or sexual relations to a large degree for a long time. I mean, obviously, there has to be some kind of legal framework around marriage and divorce and children and custody and children issues and maintenance. That obviously you have to have a legal structure around that. But in terms of, how men and women did not have the same standing in law, they didn't have the same powers of, or even just the status of majority. Um, that women were perpetual um, uh, minors, essentially, when they were married, I believe. But anyway, I'm not sure how it works in other countries actually, but I mean that's, I think, generally something how it was structured. But and then when those guardrails were removed, and then the law even modified itself within marriage or whatever, you kind of completely removed um, yeah, this is what I went into in my other recording talking about hypergamy, but anyway, I'm not going to repeat that. I don't have the energy. But yeah, I mean, I'll just say, it's worth watching. Maybe I'm a word I can't remember. Lord, I'm a word. I can't. Oh, he gave the I'm a word. I've got recordings addressing his lectures. But it was a law lord. Oh my word, this is embarrassing. Um, and the first lecture is called Law's Great Empire, and it was the Reed lectures, and it was he gave the Reed lecture series, and the first lecture is called Law's Empire. Anyway, okay, what else? Yeah, so I mean that's sort of, it's those kinds of themes. In my commentary on that, I think I go a bit deeper. Um, I modify his argument slightly, and explain why. Uh, well, I mean, I come from a different legal tradition, so the law is structured differently, and I create I think a model in which you can uh, you can blur some of the lines that he can't blur, coming from his legal tradition, but you could, but the and then the delineation of, and the distinction between what the real problem is, I put in a different kind of resolution. Um, so anyway, I'll just say that. Yeah, this is getting more embarrassing. Let me just stop this recording. I need to make another recording anyway. Okay, that's about it. Okay, this is just a small addendum because I don't know if this came through in my general argument and theses, but just because you're not trying to achieve some hypothetical reset point that is predicated on a kind of collective societal guilt and a kind of collective accountability for some kind of systemic oppression or condition, just because that isn't your moral um, predicate, for how to engage with an issue, which again is problematic because it's insoluble, and it also destroys the cultural bootstrapping of individual accountability and undermines individual agency, which is culturally toxic. Just because that isn't your route for doing something about problems doesn't mean that you can't create a decent society that has intelligent procedures and programs that facilitate access and which know how to rehabilitate bad conditions. Those things are not a false dichotomy. You don't say, oh, okay, well, because we're not trying to achieve a collective reset point um, that tries to arbitrate between whole groups of people relative to each other in some disgusting racialist social justice, sort of thing, doesn't mean that you can't try to get justice for the individual and fairness for the individual in making sure that they have access, let's say, to resources of rehabilitation or some kind of intelligently designed um, facilitation or something that essentially amounts to interventionism on some level. That doesn't mean you can't have a decent society that is trying to intervene in order to promote the welfare of individuals, but in so doing, I mean, I think you're going to be counterproductive unless unless you have a certain set of criteria that you're already fulfilling, which is that you don't create a toxic culture, you don't undermine, um, let's say, a healthy form of culture that has to have some kind of bootstrapping normativity built into it, but that and when you sort of have those tripwires set up, then you can actually design intelligent programs that might be able to be revolutionary, which might be able to do a lot of amazing stuff, but it's going to be done so in such a way that it doesn't precipitate, more inadvertent systemic oppression, a kind of a perpetual systemic oppression, because the problem is not framed in an insoluble way, which actually does have moral deficits baked into it. And I and that's those moral deficits are something like, if you're going to have a measure in your head, an ideological measure in your head, that bad luck cannot be unevenly distributed between groups or something like that. That is like a fictitious measure. That is like a completely disembodied, and just the conceptualization of that is going to infuse the whole moral of the culture with this kind of inbuilt, almost fascistic morality. I mean, which you're not going to be able, that somehow government is on the hook for infantilizing culture and cultivating it so that it doesn't lead to disparate outcomes, which is already inverted the role between the autonomy of the citizen and it gives the government a kind of pedagogical role which is just completely incommensurate with even democracy or even the dignity of the individual itself. um, and you've basically, and how you get it, how you get away with this is that you say, well, we just must reach something called a reset point, and then you justify, the means justify the ends, and you end up perpetuating never-ending toxicity, just because you're trying to reach some kind of actually quite a superficial target, which is based on, kind of justice between essentially arbitrarily categorized groups. I mean, it's interesting that just as an example, that like the whole thesis that Bret puts down, which is that black men are in short supply, and that completely messes up like the sexual marketplace, and therefore that tends towards, I mean, this is just a sort of a slight aside thing, but as if black women only had black men to choose from. I mean, so there are all these sort of these hidden things built into this, which are just culturally, as if like black culture is just this kind of this island on itself or something like that. And I think that to the extent that it has become an isolated subculture or whatever, it has definitely taken on very, very toxic cultural conventions that it has built inside of itself. But I think that all of those things are, if you don't bootstrap accountability for the culture that people are participating in, then you have essentially already created what I would call the fascistic political paradigm. Um, so I mean, that is not to say that people can't demand particular policy reform and make alternative proposals and argue for why a certain policy or specific policy will have X or Y effect. But it's slightly disgusting when your whole thing is that, well, for the issue of systemic justice or systemic or reaching some systemic reset point, suddenly we should reclassify behaviors. I mean, this is not just, I mean, like, from a libertarian value standpoint, I mean, I actually am of the mind that we should completely decriminalize drugs, because if they were very, very cheap and very, very legal, then you would remove the incentive for drug pushers wouldn't exist because there wouldn't be profit in it, and therefore the only things holding people back from, that essentially the only more, I would see that as a very positive thing for culture in general, because then the only thing stopping people from throwing their life away and indulging into drugs would have to be their own inhibition, and then, essentially you would have to create a very strict cultural taboo around the use of drugs while they were still made available to people. And, it would perhaps require a teething process. It would require, again, like a throwaway generation to be a bad example of what not to do, but essentially you would come out of it hopefully with an enlightened culture that, the individual really is the master of their fate, and they can throw their life away if they so choose to do so. And we're not just going to convert that into calling that a systemic problem if people do that to themselves, essentially. But if it's not framed as people doing it to themselves, then, you've literally denigrated people on the level of removing their agency, and, you know somehow substituting people's agency for the kind of for systemic agency. I mean, so, um, and I mean, obviously, culture is a big influence on people, but I think culture is a joint and severable sort of thing, and so it is actually better if culture is seen as being the driver of things, and that essentially people are on the hook for their individual participation or acceptance of whatever the culture might be telling them, so that essentially culture becomes a more of a conscious, engaged negotiation of individuals. Um, but yeah, I mean, that centers around essentially this bootstrapping of accountability, and I do think legalizing drugs to some extent, um, facilitates that. What's my point? Sorry, there was another point around here. But yeah, I mean, I guess the real problem is that if you don't spend the time to bootstrap a culture like this, then you essentially get to the point where there's no end to the kind of the self denigrating, um, dependence on a compensatory interventionist, infantilizing state and government. That essentially this toxic relationship never reaches essentially the reset point, because um, the moral landscape has been so contorted by this external locus of control, which basically means that self-confidence is only achieved after arriving at some reset point. And so you've put the cart before the horse, where essentially everyone becomes dependent on this kind of substitute for self-esteem, um, which they derive from essentially the propaganda around systemic oppression, that essentially the the reliance on some mythology around oppression is the continuing and perpetuation of the lack of agency. And so it's like you actually have to buy into the story about the lack of agency in order to substitute for your self-esteem, which then is extracted from the systemic oppression. That and you have this kind of perverse incentive also to populate and project onto your reality with these conditions of an external locus of control. And essentially that story becomes the source of your ideological or narratively described sort of self-esteem, that you have endured all these conditions and that you continue to endure them. And so at some point it's just everything is in the wrong place. It's like because the collective is on the hook for achieving the reset point, is on the hook for achieving the outcome. I mean, this is another sort of aspect of the insolubility, is that people can essentially lean into it, and there's nothing stopping them from leaning into it. And there's no awareness of culture, because you've created essentially an amoral paradigm with this systemic oppression reduction of reality, and it is an abstracted reduction, and it sadly, it and there are all these sort of convenient conjectures and interpretation of generalizations that go into propping up that, and that becomes essentially the mythological reality of these people, which to me is at least a proto-fascistic um, paradigm, and also relationship to the state. Essentially this weird kind of admiration for an external locus of control that must, sort of change its character to be a kind of a Führer, to be a savior of the generalization of the group, of the identity. um, and this is somewhat inescapable when you start essentially having formulations which I would say roughly amount to the kind of the toxic social justice paradigm, which Bret still has. Bret does have this, with his obsession with bad luck must be um, evenly distributed, or must not be unevenly distributed, because that is a test which is just agnostic to culture, agnostic to accountability, and and it literally destroys or dissolves essentially bootstrapping accountability in the individual. It's really got all the, and in some sense, in terms of epitheliology, when you've got essentially, when you're trying to extract indicative, sort of, you know, when you're looking for candidates for hypotheses to test, you can use something like epitheliology, where you're just taking broad surveys, and but that is never going to be. You have to actually work morally precisely from the ground up. You can't sort of thuck your suck your thumb and try to measure which way the wind is blowing, and then um, you know point at some generalization and say, well, we just need to get a hold of that, and if we can get a hold of that and deconstruct that, then then everything else will settle in place. It's a false reduction. And off you might say, okay, well, this wind blowing in this direction seems to be correlated statistically with all these bad outcomes. So now let's be suspicious about that, and then take another analysis that actually has a positive correlation, that doesn't just say, well, these things are correlated to a negative outcome. um, let's double check and see, well, what positive structure leads to the positive outcome, and work out what the gap is between doing the positive structure. So it's not so much that, oh, well, this negative incident is evil, or is the problem. It's not that there is a problem, it's that there is a lack of a solution, and then what is the gap between arriving at the solution. That is how you have to frame it, to make sure that it's actually, that it actually works out. But when you've just got this negative test that you're trying to um, remove from the system, that is sadly an endlessly insoluble sort of thing, because the more you remove, the more that might be generated. It's like, trying to trying to do things by guaranteeing that something stop, guaranteeing that something be prevented from happening. Well, that is a task that can inflate, that can, get out of control, because the more that one does that, the more that you actually create perverse incentives to rely on that feature that the government or whatever is underwriting within the system. And then everyone reorientates their functioning in order to depend on that. And it might so be that, well, you do pure research and you research the wrong thing and nothing happened. And therefore you want to be compensated for your bad luck because it wasn't your fault. But then somehow some other researcher, he just keeps on discovering things that just happen to be conducive to further progress and development and usefulness. What's the difference between these researchers? Well, maybe one of them isn't just doing pure random research. Maybe randomity or isn't the measure of what's actually going on when people are being constructive. It's like that they also have a hunch at the same time. They also have a particular vision. They also have a kind of an intuitive, like maybe they also will fail some percentage of the time, but they've got a better accomplishing rate or something like that. So, this idea that, like, that you cannot compensate for the unknown and it's just a complete random sort of thing. Um, so you can think that you can get away with just, we should remove bad luck from the system, or make it evenly distributed. Is I think even a false reduction of reality to a large extent, because there are ways and there are ways to manage things, and you're perversely incentivizing that those things, if any of these things are too complicated, now you've just meant that essentially ignorance is ignorance of the law, or ignorance of reality, of the complexity and sophistication of reality, is now going to be a defense, because it's going to help you describe bad luck. You're going to create a perverse incentive to keeping things classified as bad luck, which will be an arbitrary classification. That's going to be a fudged thing. I mean, this is something that I didn't get into deeply enough, and I'm still only outlining it, and I haven't substantiated it properly. But you have to understand that when you talk things like bad luck, it's this is a fundamentally, sort of fictitious kind of formulation. Um, this is true by definition, that there are things called bad luck, and there isn't. I bet there is not a stable definition of this that you're going to be able to, because how much bad luck can simply be avoided by intelligent planning, or by, just slightly innovative management, of this, un, I mean, unless you want to start, and I guess, between known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and how many unknown unknowns you might even be able to mitigate, um, by having, certain patterns of coherence in the structures that you do employ. So that when you are plagued by certain bad luck, it's even an ingredient for innovation and continuation. If you're building a coherent enough structure, and then you are, let's say, your structure is plagued, or your plans are plagued by bad luck, in some sense that can just be indicative of the fact that you need to unfold your structure in a different kind of way, or adapt it in a different kind of way. And then bad luck is actually a source of essentially of prepackaged information, but it's prepackaged in the light of your plan, of your structure, of your internal locus of control. As soon as you've got this formulation of bad luck, you've already created this culturally toxic ideological incentive to depend on something like an external locus of control, of a kind of a chaotic determinism that we are all ruled by. And you've essentially corrupted what I would call a very important facet of culture, which is essentially that you do have to bootstrap accountability. And trying to do something that's fundamentally antithetical to that in the name of justice, um, is a weird kind of moral infantilism, and a governmental overreach, that is toxic on a very deep level. And I do think this bug is what has destroyed politics at the moment. I mean, look, I'm not against having progressive, intelligent measures and programs, but they do have to start off with libertarian values, with empowering libertarian values and protecting them within the culture. And it is slightly tragic that certain things have to be, sacrosanct. Certain things have to be built into the interface between the government and the citizen, I believe, in order to just preserve the right kind of moral. I mean, this is why I think, religion in general took such a big knock in the 20th century, is because of the state providing this kind of inbuilt morality that was seen as a shelter that the law was providing. And the state essentially took on the role of the kind of the bringer of order. And I do think that we have to move that center back to culture, that culture needs to be the center of order, um, within a libertarian political construct and structure. And then we'll actually have an enlightened culture that's worth, that's, keeping things moving along. And then government can be seen in such a light that its policy can be properly judged, because it can't get away with trying to reach some hypothetical reset point on an issue and then end up actually countermanding its own, impetus, it fueling its own, sort of the depravity and the denigration which it's supposedly compensating for, and creating all these terrible feedback loops and such. Okay, anyway, now I'm just repeating myself, so I'll stop the recording now. I'm just going to take one more crack at um, describing the kind of the doom spiral that this kind of ideology creates, which is that if you don't bootstrap accountability for the individual in culture, then essentially you get this thing where the government is chasing the individual, and the individual is perversely incentivized to cling to um, their culturally sufficient external locus of control. You know, they're incentivized to self-sabotage in order to preserve the status quo of at least the moral paradigm that they live within, and to also to reproduce essentially the narrative, or at least the same theme within the narrative that they subsist within. Um, and so essentially the reset point, I would actually submit, is something that people will innately resist, as because the judgment of when the reset point has been reached is an incredibly toxic. Um, First of all, the whole issue is fraught with a very kind of disgusting fascistic edge to it, but that whether or not the reset point has been reached or not, um, is weird, because it also relies on these generalizations and essentially these mythological racialist imagination in people's head. But essentially, I think that there is a perverse seduction and attraction to the claim that no, we have not yet built the reset point because X, and you can essentially therefore incentivize people to investigate and to search and to create a new excuse as to why the reset point has not been reached. And this is a never-ending cycle that, as government, or as whatever collective authority or representation of the collective, is chasing down the arrival at this hypothetical reset point, you are perversely incentivizing people to culturally um, generate more problems and more obstacles as to the arrival at the reset point. And I do think that that culture of inventing obstacles to the reset point is inescapable as a psychological fact. Um, because what you're doing is you're if you reach the reset point, you have then you've created this big sort of advent, um, that now people are responsible for their own destinations, um, and therefore you have removed a convenient reliance on an external locus of control, which could have been invoked at any point. You have just deflated their mythological narrative that their identity and that their self-image is woven into. And so essentially you are in this paradoxical, or it's not exactly a paradox, but essentially you've created this very arduous conundrum for people, in that you have said, no, you are allowed to have identity politics and a mythological narrative around your identity, because it is true that we should be held collectively responsible for the systemic oppression that your identity feels, and therefore this whole spiel that I just said is a substitute for your self-esteem, or you can get self-esteem from everyone pervasively believing in this narrative. But now we're going to take that self-esteem away from you, because we're nearing the reset point. So it goes from the conundrum of endorsing identity politics and flirting with the idea that identity politics is something that can be made obsolete, and then it creates this perverse incentive for people essentially to invent rationale and to invent interpretations of the system so as to show that it can to create this argument that no, it's not obsolete. And that is essentially, and you're basically also perversely incentivizing that people endorse having an external locus of control. I mean, the whole thing is just completely toxic. It really is. And and this is because you're not willing to make the tragic, let's say, sacrifice of understanding that culture itself is an important ingredient in these things. And if we don't bootstrap culture with individual accountability, you don't have a foundation upon which to do anything and to see any problems as they exist. And again, like, why do these problems have to pertain to generalizations? Why can't they just pertain to some individuals on the ground and not some other individuals on the ground? Why do they have to be categorized and say that they belong to a group, which is a fallacy? It is fundamentally a fallacy because statistical correlation is just a way of describing things, and it doesn't have any fidelity with actual individuals. This is why you have very successful people that come from groups that are statistically systemically oppressed, but obviously the systemic oppression has not fallen on certain individuals. Why is this the case? Why don't we make positive analyses of what the positive structure was that made the difference? And this idea that, well, they didn't have the same bad luck as other people, or which is essentially amounts to the claim that they just had good luck. So they statistically got to roll the dice. That is not the case. That is mindless, blind conjecture at that point that you use in order to prop up this external locus of control, which, as I've tried to describe, is incredibly toxic. So, I mean, for all the reasons that I've just stated, these things are even fundamentally dangerous, but also because they are morally corrosive and they end up with a kind of insoluble fascistic politics. And Bret needs to open his eyes to this. He really does. And I wanted Douglas to make more of a stink about this. I wanted to see Douglas take Bret to task when he deployed this. I mean, he did emotionally. I mean, I could see that he went through the internal intellectual revulsion of what was going on, and he kind of depicted it. But I hope that this explanation might provide him with more of a platform and a basis upon which to take Bret to task, because he does need to be taken to task for this. What is ironic, I always say that the reason why this stuff is so toxic is because it has built within itself a kind of a self-denigration, a kind of a relinquishing of agency and of individual accountability and responsibility into a kind of collective vat, which is this this kind of very nebulous joint or severably, not joint and severably. That's what I just said is grammatically slightly hard to decipher. Perhaps when I mean the joint, it's weird because when you say like joint or severably or joint and severably, I need to think of a clearer way to make that concept come across. But anyway, but essentially there's a kind of there's a nebulousness in how they are treating the issue of accountability, which is just sort of poisoning everything with a very kind of convoluted immorality. That the collective is being used in a kind of in a morally um, deficient manner to kind of bin the concept of individual accountability and to bin, let's say, the value and the principle and the rationale of the fact that it does, that the concept of individual accountability does, we do need to start on the basis that it is culturally bootstrapped, because otherwise we are just lost automatically. Even if we're going to invent policy, perhaps, that does obscure the line of individual accountability, it does still need to be culturally bootstrapped. You understand? And this is why I even say such, even slightly perversely formulated things that, families need to be regarded as having the right to have a certain degree of dysfunctionality in order to keep sanctified that value of a culturally bootstrapped, that individual accountability extends towards being able to inflict consequences of one's decisions upon one's children. I mean, intellectually that might be seen as a disparate sort of thing, but I mean that is required in order to not just be adopted orphans of the state. You can't just make an orphan of every individual to the majesty and the moral superiority of the state. This is fundamentally problematic. As I've described it, a fascistic breed of politics, which I do think is what we are culturally suffering from at the moment. That is the kind of the cultural hangover that we're suffering from at the moment. Anyway, okay, so I mean, I haven't formulated this in such a robust and brilliant sort of thesis, but I've at least mechanically I've gone through, I think, all the real issues here.